in the 19th century, Edgar Allan Poe was a part of a movement which was art for the art's sake, which was against all the romanticism. Like he was saying कि ठीक है, politics सिखाना जरूरी होता है, पढ़ाना जरूरी होता है, लेकिन sometimes it is good, art is just for the art's sake. तो if art is just for the art's sake, तो वहाँ पे aesthetic pleasure की बात आती है. And whenever the aesthetic pleasure एकदम अपने peak पे होता है, that is the sublime experience, जो कि Gothic से आता है. And sublime is always about something which is बहुत ही horrifying yet beautiful.
We are discussing a very interesting character, a person, a very interesting person today, Edgar Allan Poe, but I can label him as a character because of his many whimsicalities and idiosyncrasies. Have any of you engaged with Edgar Allan Poe before? Like if you know a little bit about his life, his backstory, his background, some trivia about him, some fun facts about him, some fun stories about him, just do share.
So unfortunately, I won't be able to enlighten anyone with any facts about Edgar Allan Poe. I was just telling where I came to know. It was in my college literature class, basic that I learned. And we had read like a little brief about his life and the kind of state of mind that he was in and how he was writing. And I remember being very actually frustrated with that short story because that was like one of the first classes of literature, having no idea about what entails, and you just like spring up a story like this which has no head and tail to it and just like so random. But over the years, like the more I read about this, and you read fan fictions or just memes based on this story, and it has gotten like the love for the writer has gotten a little more, and the understanding of that writer, I would say, has gotten a little more. So yeah, that was where I had come to know of him.
I had a very similar experience. Like I hated the first story that I read of Edgar Allan Poe. And then he simply grew over me and he became an obsession over the last year.
The first time I heard about his name was in an abstract session only. I think one of the first Halloween meets we had conducted, उसमें किसी ने बोला था, let's read a short story. So someone suggested that let's read an Edgar Allan Poe story. Now I was like, कौन है, क्या है, नाम ही समझ नहीं आ रहा है इसका. So everyone's dressed up and in the mood. My expectation was that it will be like a proper pulpy B-grade horror story. It didn't turn out like that. And I'm like, अरे ये तो smart निकला. It's making me think. So everybody got a little like, अरे ये तो normal session हो गया यार. इसमें तो हम लोग कुछ आज तो मस्ती करने आए थे. So the mood was a little like confusing at that point. But now, thanks to you knowing a little bit about his background, I think people like him and their stories are always so overlapping and connected because उनका काफी life उनके work में दिख जाता है. So I'm looking forward to knowing more about his work. More than him, actually, his work I've not read much, so I would like to read more about his work and then maybe know about him.
Actually, I was doing this genre, Gothic horror tales for short stories for my children. So I came across these two names, Breeze DJ Pancake and Edgar Allan Poe. And both had very torturous and tumultuous lives. एकदम torturous, और उनकी writing भी equally torturous है.
When you read these stories for the first time, you feel कि ये बहुत random हो रहा है. But when you understand his life and what he has been through, you start to see things from his point of view, and the stories start making sense.
Yeah, like I haven't read any of his work, but like there is this incident. Like a month back, I was reading something on Sublime. Sublime has been always connected to something which is very horrifying yet beautiful, very grotesque yet beautiful. And his name like came up, like Edgar Allan Poe. So I did a research and I was like, Acha, he used to write horror stories. Then after a few days, I watched the film The Pale Blue Eye, and there was this Edgar Allan Poe detective. And now this is my first session. Within a month, I'm going to get to know a lot about Edgar Allan Poe. So like the dots are connecting.
Yeah, lovely. And like once you get into Edgar Allan Poe, you start seeing him everywhere you go. Like whatever book you pick up, उसमें भी Edgar Allan Poe के references would start popping up. It's kind of eerie that way. One interesting thing about Edgar Allan Poe is that other authors have experienced grief and they've created art out of that grief. But for Edgar Allan Poe, grief has been a constant emotion which he has not been able to escape. Even if there are small moments of hope, it reverts back to grief. And so that is why like you find similar themes in his stories as well. For example, something like like eyes, right? So even in his relationship, he would find some sparkle in someone's eyes, and then that person would die or something horrible would happen, and he would be separated from them. And that's why Edgar Allan Poe is haunted by eyes everywhere. And even like Edgar Allan Poe in his later years is famous for his indulgent drinking, and then he died at the age of I think 44, 45 under very mysterious circumstances.
My mind just remembered Van Gogh when he said that his life was totally in poverty. So I just remembered that, totally how this is so, similar in our case of artists, the famous artists who are famous now and were not famous at their time.
I think it's very interesting to like juxtapose all these artists whose lives have been so tragic, and just explore how their tragedies have been similar and also different in small ways.
Even Premchand is appreciated more posthumously than when he was alive.
How did you feel about the story in general?
It was some kind of plague or pandemic, which these high society people found a good way to protect themselves from, and not to miss out on all the gaiety which they had surrounded their lives with. So they were trying to, continue living in that lifestyle while people in the world were getting killed left, right, and center. The pace of the story, which I found very interesting, was like the tension started growing from the first page itself. There's a plague happening, people are, underground, and then the description of the sweets, and it kept getting darker and more dubious and spookier by the paragraph. That was very interesting. And there was always a hint of like a question mark. What is going to happen? You can feel that there's something going to happen. And even when that masked figure comes, you really don't know what that is. And the end was a little blurry for me. I was not able to exactly understand what happened. But yes, would love to discuss further.
Yeah, I think the structure was interesting for me as well. Like it's like 85% foreplay and just 15% climax at the end.
Yeah, first, जो मुझे strike हुआ, you require a master to create such a masterpiece. In a couple of pages, he's created a horror story, and that is highly difficult. क्योंकि setting structure बनाने में ही 400-500 वर्ड्स तो ऐसे चले जाते, because we really do not know. मतलब when we attempt to do it, जब मैं खुद attempt करती हूँ, then I realize कि बहुत शब्द चाहिए होते हैं to, and he in such a few pages, he reached the climax so quickly after creating all the horror and which can haunt you. Secondly, मुझे लगा कि since death is inevitable, how the prince, वही mindset, luxury, opulence, splendor, and trying to escape something such a huge phenomena like death. वो मुझे बहुत strike हुआ, and bringing this into death, horror stories, murder, death, thriller, वो एक part होता है horror story का, but the way he has personified death, and death has been used as a character, which I really liked about it.
The end of the story, I concluded with that, the prince was obviously he was a prince, right? So he must have a place to hold on, and he must have some power, right? And he had some responsibility over the people. But what he did, when the plague come, he just called over his 1,000 courtiers and just created something where they can hide. And they thought that with all the things, all the resources, they can save themselves from the death and all. But in the end, they couldn't do that, and death is something that is inevitable, as Sangeeta aunty said. And it was the only thing that I found interesting, that it was so nicely written, or even though I didn't understand much of the words and paragraphs, but still, the way it is written, it's so nice. And how a very big message, maybe, sometimes there are subtle messages that are very big in a subtle way. It was showed here, so that was the only thing I liked here.
I was confused for a major chunk of the story, because I was trying to make sense of what the plot is. I think the plot really kickstarted only in the second half or the third half, I would say. उसके पहले तो discussion ही चल रहा था. I end up it's something that I have had a problem with, generally speaking, that description of things around you tend to cover so much of so many pages that बात शुरू नहीं होती है, and थोड़ा मेरे को irritating लगता है, because it's just my I don't know, I wouldn't say less attention span, but just the want to move forward in terms of where the story is going. But when it escalates really well. So it's like जैसे फिल्म में भी बोलते हैं कि when you're writing a script, if start A, then go to B, but end at Z. Like it should end at a peak point. So it does end that way here as well. While reading the story and right now thinking about it as well, the masked, the masked person standing over there, a parallel came to my mind about of this film Party by Govind Hilani. In that, the last image of the film was of Nasiruddin Shah. पूरी फिल्म उसकी बात हो रही है, and the entire film is basically a conversation in a house itself. Very high intellectual people just having conversations about how the world should be and etc etc, and क्या खराबी है दुनिया में etc etc, बातें यहाँ पे हो रही है. And at the end, the image, also the walking image of the person who's dead, who's actually on the ground, maybe trying to solve something and fighting for things. उसका पूरा bloody तरीके से नसीरुद्दीन शाह just comes and walks, and that's the shocking screaming person at the end that the film ends with. So it sort of creates a parallel between how secluded bubbles में isolation में intellectual conversation होती है, and how reality can be very different in terms of how actually things work out. Apart from that, also the cultural classicism that comes in, them having a way to talk about these things. Both economic and cultural sense में एक superiority उन लोग की है कि वहाँ पे बैठ के वो लोग हाई आर्ट की बातें भी कर सकते हैं और चीजों की बातें भी कर सकते हैं और सेफ भी है financially. I think the masked person is not just death, but the death of a commoner, death of somebody who's poor. मेरा understanding वो था कि you all of you are here piling on and standing on the death of all these other people. That's why you are able to be inside this house right now. So it's a very specific selective death, and not just death in general. Not just the fact that death सबको आनी ही है, या फिर death मतलब plague है तो सबको मरना ही है, वैसा नहीं. I feel it's a very specific kind of person's death. It's a specific class of people जिनका death वहाँ पे दिखाया जा रहा है.
According to my knowledge, I think they are talking about here Black Death that plagued in Europe and Africa. Also, I could draw a parallel with a film, The Seventh Seal, where it comprised of that Black Death, and plague was coming all over Europe, and it was spreading over Africa also. So I think I visually saw Seventh Seal while reading this story. And one more thing that that was attracting about this story was the detailing of the space and time, how he showed the seven suits. And it is also, I read an analogy, it was also uh, drawn parallel with Shakespeare, how the seven stages of life, the seven colors that represent the imperial suits. So that thing I take from it. And one more thing is the what to say, the ebony clock, and how specifically time is being described, through writing. It's great. How the space is being, because when it was there was a description saying that in every 20 to 30 years there is a turn. So I can visually see that. And also he didn't mention that the suit was on the right side, he told on the extreme eastern side. So the grandeur of the that castle, the the spaciousness of the castle is also been described in such a way. So that's
Yeah.
all I got.
He has this band-aid kind of thing going on where at the end he'll just pulls the band-aid with the climax. And one more thing I've noticed with this previous work also and this one also, that when he writes, he completely sans dialogues or any direct speech. It has to be completely indirect. It has to be very descriptive. I think it's not one might say it's very common with all short stories, but I don't feel so, because a lot of modern or recent short story authors like Ruskin Bond do have dialogues in their short stories, right?
Yeah.
There's one more thing is that one analogy that came to my mind is, in COVID, how celebrities had the huge houses, how they were
Maldives.
promoting being happy and being okay with COVID, just chilling, and while like the second wave, especially while people are, it's very terrible outside, reminds me of that, especially with the seven suits and, the many rooms in the castle. And then all of these celebrities also go and get COVID later, right? So something along those lines.
Just wanted to comment on the auditory, spatial, and the this, what do you call it, the temporal, how he plays with all of the three. And even though there's a lot of description of it, and even with such less dialogues, we can visualize what is happening, where it is happening, how it is happening, what time and what context it is happening. So the thing is that while reading the story, the creation of a film happens simultaneously in my head. So as I go along, there's like there's visuals being created. So that is something that I've always loved about Poe's work, be it poetry or be it short stories. I just it's like साथ में you have to create something of your own in order to process and understand. Otherwise तो पहले उसमें तो बिल्कुल समझ में नहीं आएगा.
I find it very interesting when like we talk about these different effects and how we think that there's a lot going on, because on the face of it, it goes opposite to what Edgar Allan Poe believed, because he was a big proponent of efficiency of stories. I'll just read a small excerpt of what he wrote in a review that he wrote of another story. A skillful artist has constructed a tale. He has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having deliberately conceived a certain single effect to be wrought, he then invents such incidents, he then combines such events and discusses them in such tone as may best serve him in establishing this one preconceived effect. If his very first sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then in his very first step, he has committed a blunder. In the whole composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. So, like in this context, what do you think? Like, if there's a lot of imagery going on in this story, and if there are a lot of descriptions going on in this story, I would love to hear whether these different elements from this particular story, they contribute to a certain singular effect, and if yes, what is that one singular effect that Edgar Allan Poe wants to like push through this story?
Actually, he didn't use olfactory at all. He didn't use auditory also, because there are no sounds. Only, I think, through sensory imagery, he developed the entire story. And I found the structure too crisp. मतलब अगर आपको एक की सीन डेवलप करना होता है तो आपको 350 वर्ड्स कम पड़ जाते हैं. Here, right from the intro till the body and till the conclusion, he's created the story in just 6-7 pages. So naturally, बहुत ज़्यादा imagery का use हुआ है, and subtle sensory imagery. मतलब वो इबनी क्लॉक जैसे सौरभ ने मेंशन किया, वो मुझे भी स्ट्राइक हुआ. और बाकी चीजें तो इतना, एंड जो उसने कलर का एलिमेंट्स यूज किया है ना, जैसे अपन बोलते हैं ऑरेंजेस फॉर वाइटलिटी, एनर्जी, तो वो सारे कलर्स आर सिनोनिमस विद हॉरर. जो भी उसने यूज किए, चाहे ब्लैक हो, पर्पल हो, most of them in the decadent state are significant of horror. जो दूसरी बात मुझे लगी, I don't know, like वही जैसे संकल्प ने कहा, whether you are rich or poor, since he is coming from a poor background, वो क्या ना ये चाहता है कि तुम rich हो तो क्या हो, even you cannot escape that.
Clock which represents our time on this earth, and every time the clock chimed, so basically every time it was समय जब बोल रहा था, so everyone had to, like everyone stopped and actually took notice. And there is some reverence or some kind of religious sentiment or some kind of supernatural or unworldly element associated with every time the clock chimed, because everyone felt something very raw, because they were all leading very masked lives down at that establishment. And every time the clock chimed, there was some part of the clock which was, I mean, beautiful, musical, but then it was probably also calling out that there are there's a lot of death and destruction happening. And kind of like a humor at living this kind of a lavish lifestyle at such a time,
Yeah.
something like that, right?
Yeah,
And
that
something which the people were not wanting to accept, wanting to realize, wanting to come to terms with. But then time has its own way of making people realize. So I think while obviously the book is only like a readable format, but I could feel the sounds while I was reading it, because in the
yeah,
video, there were cues about the fact that because the narrator is someone unknown and uncertain, so you kind of feel like you are the narrator, you are present right there in that suite, and you are one of these spectators, and you are able to see everything that is happening. So you also are able to hear that sound and able to, that anxiety grows with you, right?
yeah,
And there was, to add to the effect, there was also, I wanted to read just few phrases from across the story
yeah,
to explain that there was only one singular point of describing death, despair, and how it is inevitable, and it doesn't distinguish between class or any other thing, right? Because the story starts with the Red Death had long devastated the country, right? No pestilence had ever been so fatal, so hideous. So at the beginning itself, they set the context that it is a death and destruction kind of a pandemic kind of a scenario, right? The second paragraph itself starts with the contrary, and saying that,
yes.
but there was this prince who was happy and dauntless and sagacious, who was kind of like challenging, who was kind of trying to avoid the core
I mean, his name
basically
itself.
right, exactly. So kind of like the antithesis of what was happening. Like I'm antithesis is not the right word. I'm not getting the right word.
Yeah.
Right. And then towards the end, the last paragraph starts with, and now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death.
Oh, yes.
So these people who were trying to escape that reality actually had to face it ultimately. So
Yeah.
all of those elements are pointing at just one thing, grief and death, no one can escape it, especially, the privileged kind who want to turn away from it. So that was like all the elements added to that effect. So that was, I think, the unity of effect, which the video also talked about.
Chiming of the clock now. So I know this thing. I don't know what it means in the context of the story, but in the older times, churches were used both to signify passing of the hour, and they were also used when someone would die in the village. So I don't know what that exactly means in the context of the story, but I find that connection to be very interesting.
He said that every one of his friends and nearby relatives were mean, took a shelter in that castle. So I believe that every age group that Shakespeare mentioned in the 7 stages of life would be there. It might be Prince Prosperous father who might be in his last stage of death. There might be a child, there might be an infant, there might be a, what to say, schoolboy, there might be means anyone. And as the colors are mentioned, so starting from blue I think also represents calm and passivity, means those who cannot I don't know exactly I am saying the correct word or not. Those who don't revolt directly, they accept what is happening. So I think there is a child mentality, and then the color grows on. And one specific thing I read about it is that the color purple, so purple is associated with the color that aristocrat or rich people can afford. So that signified that aristocracy,
Yeah.
means that purple color. i
Yeah.
i don't know exactly, just sharing means what
Yeah,
I
very
understood
possible.
about.
Yeah.
And at last it was not red, it was black. So I would like to mention one trivia. I read it. Her
Yeah.
wife Elizabeth was having tuberculosis at that time.
Hmm.
So she was coughing red blood, and he set the story during the time of Black Death. So he have disguised the Black Death with the mask of red. So it was told that the title of the story, the mask of the Red Death. So it was actually Black Death.
I do feel that Edgar Allan Poe did take a lot of inspiration from Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's plays, masquerades had a very huge role in number one, in showing class conflict, number two, in showing disguise, especially when it comes to sad periods of time or times when bad things were happening around. For example, Merchant of Venice, where Antonio is shown to be really sad. Jessica is upset about, leaving her father, and there's a split in between where she's confused, etc. There's a masquerade that happens over there as well, to show joy amidst all of that grief. So I do think in terms of masquerades and how masquerade has been used over here, there has been inspiration drawn from Shakespeare for sure.
A lot of his work is inspired from his own life, and death in his life has had a very significant impact. So I was reading a little bit about what his life had looked like before joining the session. He had lost his mother at the age of 2. He lost touch with his own siblings. He had faced the death of his wife, and basically at the end in life he was not left with anyone around, and there's a lot of death and grief that he had to deal with throughout his life. Definitely in his art we can see a lot of death. And circling a little bit back to the story, a few points which I remembered while I was browsing through the story again. The last room was the black room, and एक आध जगह it is mentioned कि western end में, and west is usually associated with, say, the end of things, because that's where the sun sets. So probably वो 7 stages of life तो वो थोड़ा सा वैसे भी connect हो रहा है कि the 7th stage is death, and it is associated with black color. And
Oh my God.
because there was also mention of that there's no light in that, matlab wo jo torches the, they were not lit. Still the glass panes used to reflect red color. Red again, which is a symbolism of blood, death, something gory. So and people did not want to go towards the black room. People were in all the other rooms, but they didn't want to go to the black room. There's something about death which everyone is fascinated about, but they don't want to get near it. So even when that masked figure comes, everyone is fascinated by it, but also fear it. The chime of the clock, it is very fascinating, but fear inducing. So I mean, everything points towards. So when you say that Edgar Allan Poe was very direct in his approach to story writing, he just wanted to convey whatever was the point straight, and everything pointed towards that fact. So I mean, I just love how he was so focused about giving the message, and everything else, like all the visual elements, gave it such a beautiful, that aesthetic point. It all comes together into that amazing experience of reading and being a part of that story. Loved it. I mean, it is death. मतलब ये पूरी story, which is the art in itself, was about death and how death finds you ultimately. So